Chapter 49-43. As this exquisite mist fell, frost also followed, and the battlefield in the giant hall was frozen. Jian Wushuang, who was fighting fiercely with the two Dian immortals, felt that the temperature all over his body dropped sharply, as if he had fallen into an endless cave, and the forest was extremely cold. And the two Dian immortals who flew into the air were also directly frozen in the air at this moment. Jian Wushuang couldn't hold back his strength and slammed out. The two Dian immortals that were enclosed by ice were directly blasted into countless ice crystals and scattered all over the ground. Ding, 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 the crisp ice crystal fell, and the giant hall fell into dead silence again. Of the three Dian immortals who fought against each other, there was only one left at this moment, and he did not know his life or death. Throwing the ice crystal off his palm, Jian Wushuang calmly looked at Bian Ziyuan. Bian Ziyuan's eyes were cold, and he stepped forward and said in a deep voice, "Are you looking for death?" He didn't speak, and between his palms, an invisible sword was condensed. The originally silent hall was instantly filled with a sense of killing. "Do you think you are my opponent?" Bianzi took a step forward, an endless stream of clouds and water patterns appeared, and at the same time a light will appeared from behind him. Just as the battle was over, the young man spoke with a low voice. "My heavenly palace is not the place where you do your hands, so give me a little restraint, otherwise the cornerstone of this heavenly palace, you will use your fairy body to cushion it." Hearing the words, Bian Ziyuan withdrew an unprecedentedly powerful force and retreated behind him. Jian Wushuang also scattered the sword in his hand, and looked at the young man walking towards him and said, "I'm sorry for the fact today. I left on my own and will never step here again. Leave. Just leave like this. You killed nearly 10 black robe envoys under my seat, how do we calculate this account?" The young man looked at him with a faint smile and said, "Do you think I will let you go easily? What do you want to do?" Jian Wushuang looked at him. He smiled slightly, "What I want is simple, it's just a transaction, even if you pay me back." Hearing these words, Jian Wushuang frowned slightly. What he disliked the most was this kind of transaction. He felt the discomfort of being controlled by others. "You only have this option." The young man pointed a finger at him. As his voice fell, black robe envoys began to walk out in the dark on both sides of the giant hall. After pondering for a moment, Jian Wushuang said in a cold voice, "What deal? This transaction is very simple, but you need to leave a place alive before I can tell you the terms of the transaction." The young man walked slowly to Jian Wushuang's face, and said with a smile. Jian Wushuang felt a great crisis inexplicably, but it was too late. A total of 40 black robe envoys released their respective powers at this moment and blasted on the floor of the hall. In an instant, as if opening a huge dust-sealed door, blood-red ripples appeared on the entire floor. "Good luck." The young man smiled weirdly, and pushed him down after reaching out. Jian Wushuang was shocked. He wanted to resist, but the giant hall behind him had become an endless sea of blood. One blood palm grabbed him, and then dragged it directly into the blood sea, disappearing. The blood wave rolled and everything was calm again. At this moment, Bian Ziyuan came to the young man's side and asked, "His Royal Highness, are you planning to put all hope on him? Do you have any other way?" He carried his hands on his back, as if thinking about something. "He gave me a very different feeling. I have a hunch that if we can leave this endless sea, we will be with him. There is a big relationship. I hope so, the time we have been trapped here is too long." Bian Ziyuan sighed softly, looking at the surging sea of blood. "What if he can't survive this blood test? Then let him die in it." This sea of blood was originally made up of Wangshan's bones. There is no more than one, and a lot less. Wow! In his ears was the sound of water flowing like a clear spring, and Jian Wushuang woke up almost when he was plunged into this sea of blood. He directly condensed the invisible sword, and then cut off all the blood arms that were entwined with the immortal body. Looking into the eyes, everything is pure blood red. Unlike the endless sea of blood in the Sand Demon Cavern, this sea of blood does not have the kind of cold and dead air, and the vicious coldness, but is full of forbidden auras. This kind of restriction is very weird, full of the aura of ancient precipitation, and gives people a sense of unknown severity. Swinging a sword to cut away the hands entwined with him, Jian Wushuang let the fairy slowly fall. He could feel that there was only boundless death, and there was no other threat. Where is this place, and why does it give me a feeling of forbidden land? Jian Wushuang recalled in his mind, while looking at everything in front of him. Soon, his figure sank into the deepest part of this sea of blood. What surprised him was that the depths of this sea of blood turned out to be land. It is indeed land, only land paved with bones. The broken fairy bodies have long been turned into piles of bones, stacked on top of everything, forming a boundless land of bones. Standing under this sea of blood, Jian Wushuang watched this scene with a little shock, but he was also a little shocked because of his firm mind. How many immortals need to fall before they can pile up this boneless earth? This is a confined space under the sea of blood. There is an endless sea of blood above his head and a boundless earth of bones under his feet. Beneath the infinite, only he was alone, lonely to the extreme. Why would you throw me under this sea of blood? After converging his mind, Jian Wushuang began to think about this question. This sea of blood is endless, full of the breath of ancient prohibition, like an ancient battlefield left by one party, rather than a prisoner's execution ground. Could it be that he intends to give me some chance here? He thought of various possibilities again. And at this moment, following the sobbing of the cold and long wind, a cold and charming voice quietly sounded behind Jian Wushuang. Wushuang, look back and see who I am. Jian Wushuang suddenly turned around, only to see a figure wearing a black gold-pleated skirt. That is a woman. A black and gold-pleated skirt made her figure set against the luxury and coldness to the extreme. They were no more than a few feet apart, and they could clearly see their faces. At this moment, Jian Wushuang's eyes condensed unconsciously, and his heartbeat speeded up a bit. Facing such a mysterious woman, he always felt a certain kind of shackles in his heart. Since the first encounter in the first great voyage, they have only hurriedly counted. Chapter 49-44. Although they only hurriedly counted the faces, they could always meet in unexpected places, as if they were destined to never leave. The long wind blew her long hair, and even the black and gold-pleated skirt was blowing, like black and gold flowers in full bloom, making her impossible to see. Above this boneless earth, she is the only one who is alone. Withered and cold, yet clear and beautiful. She is Zhang Ying. The long hair was blown away by the long wind, and then she took out a golden hairpin from her waist and coiled the scattered long hair behind her. A pair of Yingmu with a unique charm, as if full of autumn water, fixedly looking at Jian Wushuang. At this moment, Jian Wushuang didn't even evade that kind of gaze, but for some reason, he couldn't avoid it, so he could only look at her. She is truly stunning, but she carries an indescribable danger. After the two looked at each other for a while, Zheng Ying walked towards him slowly. Jian Wushuang wanted to retreat, but found that the movement was a little unnatural. Go ahead, why are you here? She had a very unfriendly tone and questioned him. Listening to this familiar tone, Jian Wushuang began to be a little confused. Are you really Zheng Ying? It's not my illusion. Answer my question first. Zheng Ying's tone is beyond doubt, her stunning cheeks faintly angry. Jian Wushuang was helpless, and finally compromised. Well, I came here mainly because I wanted to find Diqing, and he was banished here. Then, he told Zheng Ying about everything that happened before. After hearing all this, Zheng Ying's sword brows frowned slightly. Stupid, just for his own sake, just venture here alone. Do you know where this is? Don't you be afraid of dying here? Jian Wushuang immediately said, I have 90% confidence that I can find the truth and leave here with him, but if I do not happen to fall here, then I can only recognize it. Stupid, then do you know that I am the catastrophe you are facing now? Zheng Ying said coldly as he looked at him, and then suddenly drew a sharp soft sword from the jade belt around his waist. The tip of the sword reached his throat. Jian Wushuang didn't do anything, and he didn't even release Yanli. He could feel that Zheng Ying had no intention to kill, and he didn't even release Yanli. Are you the real Zheng Ying or the fake Zheng Ying? He was completely puzzled and began to fall into doubt. Zheng Ying retracted his soft sword and said coldly, Of course I am a fake. Jian Wushuang did not expect that she would answer so simply. Withdrawing the soft sword, Zheng Ying continued to say coldly, Remember every word I said. Here, you don't believe in any immortal, just make a path. don't believe anyone who tells you anything. Hearing this, he pondered for a moment, then asked uncertainly, then what you said, should I believe it? Zhang Ying was silent, and finally said, don't let me smoke you. After speaking these last words, she turned and left. Remember every word I say, it can support you to live here. Zhang Ying's figure finally dissipated before Jian Wushuang's eyes, as if nothing had ever appeared. But Jian Wushuang knew that she had indeed been here. Strange, why does she know where I am every time? Jian Wushuang touched his chin with some doubts. At this point, he has determined that it is indeed Zhang Ying himself, although every time she appears, she is a little too unbelievable. Retaining his mind, Jian Wushuang thought about what Zhang Ying had conveyed in his heart, and then decided to set off. This white bone land under the sea of blood has been extending endlessly. He guessed that if he wanted to leave here, he could only keep moving forward. If this is the case, then break a path. Jian Wushuang's eyes became sharp at this moment, and the entire fairy body was like a real sword hidden from the front. It seemed that as his mind turned, the deadly bone earth began to shake. Like boiling, the broken bones began to recover. The breath of the supreme fairy. A dilapidated fairy bone lifted up the sword. It seemed to be attracted by the aura exuding from Jian Wushuang's body. Two groups of dying black light surged in the eye sockets hungry. It suddenly raised the broken real sword in its hand, and rushed towards it as if it went crazy. Jian Wushuang shook his head helplessly. The next moment, an invisible sword condensed in his hand. Facing the army of bones that gradually gathered in front of him, he released the most severe blow. Wushuang Kendo, Xingyihu Haijianyi, the first style. Star. An unremarkable straight cut fell, like dropping a stone in the lake. Boom. The endless trend burst completely at this moment. Millions of sword intents have risen from the sky, each of them is the peak sword intent. With the surge of millions of sword intent, thousands of Orn pillars also exploded. The bones of the earth quaked, as if they were torn apart. The army of bones that was running wild, under this sword, was directly broken into powder. 100,000 bones, 1 million sword intent. The mountains and seas will fall, and the heavens are trembling under this sword. Countless bones shattered into dust and returned to the earth again. A figure, stepping on countless bones, with 1 million sword intent, moving forward firmly. At the same time, in the giant palace of Tianlu, the young man standing in front of the sea of blood and Bian Zifa, after seeing this shocking scene, the corner of their eyes jumped fiercely. Especially Jian Wushuang carrying 1 million sword intent and easily strangling the army of bones is a scene of refreshing cognition. After a long while, the young man took a deep breath and said, "What is the origin of this guy? How could it be Yang Xian?" Bian Ziyuan shook his head. "I don't know much about him. I'm afraid I don't know his origin without Yang Xian. He is very mysterious. For him, this assessment will probably be completed soon." The young man shook his head and said, "Done? I am afraid it is impossible to complete. Under this blood sea, there is still an existence comparable to an emperor. Do you want him to get that person's inheritance?" Bian Ziyuan looked a little solemn. "This is not something I think he can get. No one knows what that person means. My only hope now is that he can come out alive." The young man said, "Perhaps when he walks out, it is the time we know when we can leave here." Crack. The last sound of sword cutting fell, and there was no other fairy bone to stand before Jian Wufang. These fairy bones, which have been lost for so many years, are already fragile to the extreme, and they are not climate at all. If the ordinary Dian immortal entered this place, he might hate it, but Jian Wushuang is different. These immortal bones can't even cause any effective damage to him. Chapter 49-45. Every sword intent he released was enough to easily kill any fairy bone. Millions of sword intent originate from swordsmanship and go round and round, endlessly. Even after killing all the immortal bones in front of him, he didn't expend too much effort. This is a road to the bones of immortality, and I don't know how many immortals fell here to cast it. Although the army of 100,000 immortal bones had been revived, Jian Wushuang knew that this was just the beginning. This river and bones road hidden under the imperial city seems to have not been opened for countless years, full of an unspeakable ancient prohibition. Jian Wushuang was alone, stepping on the broken fairy bones under his feet, and marching towards the deepest part of the White Bone Road. Everything has just begun. In order to prevent the occurrence of unexpected situations, he directly let the sword intent flow around his body, and once a danger approaches, he can directly react. On the road to the bones, apart from the bones whose fairy rhyme was lost, there were only treasures and true swords that were broken everywhere. They have been broken for countless years, and have long fallen asleep with their owners. The most well-preserved of these treasures are some real swords. They thrust into the ground obliquely, although the sword's edge is not sharp, but there is still a powerful force surging, as if waiting for a battle. The more he moved forward, the more Jian Wushuang felt a little unusual. The sense of ancient prohibition became stronger again. At the same time, the bones under the feet were very different from before, turning into grayish-white. It was another 100 feet of distance. Jian Wushuang saw a strange scene. In the middle of the road in front of the bones, a pile of bones made up of countless bones blocked the way forward. The grey-white broken fairy bones had already lost the slightest rhyme, but they gave Jian Wushuang an unprecedented pressure. He has an intuition that there is something dangerous in this pile of bones. If he follows his character, he will certainly not move forward, but the current situation has forced him to move forward. Stepping into the realm of bone piles, a violent storm erupted in an instant. In the next moment, the pile of bones as high as 10,000 feet shattered suddenly, and a dark arm that looked like a real dragon came out of it, and slammed heavily towards the location of Jian Wushuang. Jian Wushuang was taken aback. Although all these changes came too fast, he still expected it. With his arms crossed and supported, he actually received the blow of the sky. Boom! He snorted, and the fairy body flew upside down 100 meters away in an instant. The bones of the earth were plowed by his legs' too deep gully, and his body shape was stopped. Forcibly holding back the qi and blood tumbling in the fairy body, Jian Wushuang looked forward with solemn eyes. The pile of bones as high as 10,000 feet has fallen down like a mountain, and the two black arms that look like real dragons pushed away the countless bones, gradually revealing the true face. Seeing this scene, even Jian Wushuang was a little moved. Under the pile of white bones, there was a dark figure that was as high as 10,000 feet, like a low mountain. This pitch-black figure sits cross-legged in the middle of the White Bone Road. The whole body is extremely dark, the chest is open, the belly is big and the face is round. Especially the belly is so big that it occupies almost 2/3 of the size of the whole body, living like a fat metria. The Zen clothes on his body had been ruined to the extreme, and his fat face was peculiarly shiny. 2 red lights burst out from his squinted eyes, and only greed was left in his eyes looking at Jian Wushuang. Immediately afterwards, Jian Wushuang's somewhat uncomfortable scene appeared. A series of waterfall-like saliva dripped from the mouth of the big belly Buddha, almost converging into a river. Then he opened his palms, grabbed the fairy bones scattered on both sides, stuffed them into his mouth and chewed. The weird creak resounded on the road to the bones. Jian Wushuang frowned, already quietly condensing an invisible sword. Hey, the smell of a real fairy, I haven't smelled it for a long time. The big belly Buddha let out a weird laugh, and his saliva almost turned into a river. Let me take a small bite, just a small bite, I won't eat you all, okay? Jian Wushuang didn't bother to talk nonsense with him, and the invisible sword in his hand pointed straight forward. If you can't kill me, just let me take a sip and I will let you go, okay? Daitu Buddha said greedily. Die. He whispered, in order to make a quick battle, he directly used the ancestral technique. The reason why Jian Wushuang has not abandoned the ancestral technique now is because these two types of ancestral techniques have grown up and have not been online. Today's 2 styles of ancestral techniques are enough to match the immortal style. The ancestors, the power world Tianmen, and the heavenly gates were all released at this moment. 2 magnificent heavenly gates straddled the head of the big belly Buddha, and then a giant finger and a giant palm, carrying endless power, slammed into his head fiercely. The next moment, wailing resounded. The brilliance of the 2 ancestors directly enveloped him. The power is endless, exploding on this boneless road. The wailing of the big belly Buddha resounded across the wild. When the surviving prestige of the ancestral arts dissipated, the big and round head of the big belly Buddha had collapsed. An unknown dark liquid came out of his broken head. "I want you to die." He was furious to the extreme, and strong suction suddenly burst out of his huge mouth. Jian Wushuang, who was standing hundreds of feet away, felt the suction and hurriedly swung his sword to cut away the terrible suction. Seeing that he did not draw him over, the big belly Buddha stretched out his arm of several thousand feet and smashed it. Every time he waved his arm, it was enough to shatter the space. The bones continued to collapse, the huge arm smashed down. Jian Wushuang quickly avoided. This powerful blow was enough to make ordinary Yangxian hate on the spot. Holding the invisible sword, Jian Wushuang jumped 1,000 feet in one step, and boarded one of the arms of the big-belly Buddha. "Jie, come to my mouth." Big-bellied Buddha opened his huge mouth and swallowed away facing him. Jian Wushuang turned around and glanced at the giant mouth, and then the real sword in his hand suddenly pierced into his arm. "Break it for me," Jian Wushuang roared in a low voice. At this moment, the million-sword intent rushed into the arms of the big-bellied Buddha along the blade. The sword intent was like mountains and seas, bursting out loudly. In the next moment, the huge arm of thousands of feet exploded directly from the middle, and the infinite sword intent came out. With just a sword, the arm of the big-belly Buddha was broken. The arm fell like a god, and hit the road of the bones heavily, stirring up smoke and dust. Falling to the ground again, Jian Wushuang raised his sword and looked at the wailing big-bellied Buddha, thinking about how to quickly kill him. Through this short fight, Jian Wushuang vaguely guessed that he was most likely rank 6 Dian immortal, and it was probably not a simple matter to kill him completely. Miscellaneous, "I want you to die. I want you to die without a place to be buried." Chapter 49-46. The big belly Buddha roared in anger, and he was extremely angry when he broke his arm. Then he slammed Jian Wushuang again with his only arm. The space was torn apart, and he quickly avoided. Looking at the big belly Buddha who had lost his senses, Jian Wushuang's mind turned, and the next moment he directly raised his realm to the highest point. The endless Xuanhe pattern flows all over his body, and the unknown strength that surpasses the immortal is prosperous to the extreme. At this moment, Jian Wushuang was like the supreme immortal, and all the laws of heaven were crawling under his feet. Seeing this scene, even the arm that big belly Buddha smashed down has a moment of hesitation. Jian Wushuang didn't dodge or avoid, just stretched out a pointer to the front. Boom! When the two collided, the arm that looked like a real dragon was actually sealed in mid-air, making it difficult to get even an inch. A hint of uncertainty flashed in the eyes of the big belly Buddha, and he realized that he really couldn't do it. Immediately afterwards, Jian Wushuang also spoke, "Let me go, I will let you die, otherwise I can kill you with one arm, and I can kill your fairy source." "Exterminate my fairy source, hehe, relying on your small body?" The big belly Buddha smiled and shot greedy eyes. "It's not impossible to let you go, you just let me take a bite, I will let you go." Jian Wushuang snorted angrily, and the true shadow of Wu Self appeared directly behind him. The true shadow of selflessness, which can be solidified, was released by Jian Wushuang once in the void battlefield of the previous 6-day realm, and it was infinitely mysterious. In an instant, the tens of thousands of feet of selfless true shadow was completely solidified, which was even 1,000 feet higher than that of the big belly Buddha. Seeing this horrible scene in front of him, the big belly Buddha who was still laughing strangely became stagnant, and even forgot what to do next. "If you don't give way, I'm not welcome." Jian Wushuang and the huge selfless real shadow behind them both spoke at the same moment, and boundless power escaped, terrifying to the extreme. Seeing the big-bellied Buddha who had been stagnated, he secretly breathed a sigh of relief, and thought to himself that he had been shocked. However, the next moment, the originally stagnant big-bellied Buddha suddenly laughed wildly, and his remaining arm suddenly stopped the confronting Wu Self true shadow. At the same time, his extremely huge belly broke open at this moment, revealing a gluttonous mouth that could almost swallow the world. His entire belly turned out to be a mouth. Jian Wushuang's heart suddenly rises badly. He wants to remove the true shadow of Wu, but finds that everything is too late. I want to swallow you all." After big-bellied Buddha said these last words, his huge belly suddenly opened up, exposing his gluttonous mouth, and drew towards Jian Wushuang. Under this terrible suction force, the egoless true shadow that is as high as 10 feet can't move at this moment. A wisp of cold sweat gushed from Jian Wushuang's temples, and he never thought that this big-belly Buddha would have such a killer mace. Under this terrible suction, his fairy body was shaken. The immeasurable true shadow of selflessness shattered directly at this moment, turning into countless stars into the belly of the big-belly Buddha Chi Dorwu. Not only the disappearance of the true shadow of Wu-Wu, but also all the power in Jian Wushuang's fairy body is fading quickly. He was shocked, and instantly released his sword intent without reservation. Wushuang Kendo, Xingyihu Haijianyi, the second style. River. The lofty Tianhe descended from the sky. This is a vast sword composed of billions of sword intents, with a powerful force that cannot be seen directly. This sword was enough to oppress 100 Yangxian, causing the heavens to tremble. But this mighty sword, an all-inclusive sword, disappeared in the next moment. It's not so much disappearing, it's more appropriate to say everything is swallowed. Wei Wei Jianhe was also swallowed under the terrible suction. Jian Wushuang was completely shocked. As his strongest swordsmanship, he was disintegrated and absorbed. What is the origin of this big-belly Buddha? With the true shadow of the selflessness, the energy of the sword intent with the shape of the river was swallowed into the abdomen, and the figure of the big-belly Buddha once again exploded by thousands of feet, and the entire belly was almost exploding, and it was extremely large. Even I want to swallow. Are you not afraid to die? Jian Wushuang reluctantly stabilized his figure, angrily said. Hold me. Hey, no one can hold me, I can swallow the sky. He said with a weird smile, his face full of madness. Swallow the sky and the earth, then I will support you to death today. Jian Wushuang gritted his teeth and said coldly. This billions of strands of strength swept the bones behind him almost instantly. At this moment, the true sword that had been inserted diagonally into the ground seemed to be inspired by a certain kind, and the silent blade suddenly appeared cold. A cold light. 10 cold light. Thousands of cold light. 10,000 cold light. At this moment, all the silent real swords on Bai Gulu completely awakened, and each sword uttered a clear sword sound, as if it had been called by the master. Jian Wushuang stood in the void, his arms raised. As his arms lifted, all the cold light burst out, and the true sword of the 10,000 ways rose into the sky. They all hung high behind Jian Wushuang, exuding endless momentum. At this moment, he is like the master of Kendo, the lord of 10,000 swords. What Jianfeng refers to is the journey. Go with. The sword waved his palms, and tens of thousands of true swords exploded into their respective magnificent trends. They seem to be able to perceive that this is the last moment they can bloom, so the endless sword intent at this moment is simply extremely prosperous. They seemed to have returned to the eve of fighting with their masters, and they screamed excitedly. Then they rushed towards the big-belly Buddha together. The vast sword intent illuminates the entire road to the bones. At this moment, Jian Wushuang became serious about it. Swords have souls. They are connected with the master's mind and can even resonate with the soul. At this moment, they are all willing to release their peak sword in his hands. After the peak came to an end. When the sword intent reached its peak, all the true swords were broken. It was all broken into powder, and there was no possibility of repairing it. No, do not want. The sword intent is like the mountains and the sea will pour, directly engulfing the big-belly Buddha and covering it. 10,000 extreme sword intent, finally blooming without reservation. Bai Gulu rolled up the dust, and even the river of blood above his head fluctuated, and it seemed that it might pour down at any time. Jian Wushuang still stood still on the spot, his eyes fluctuated a little, and finally he was calm. He looked at the place where the 10,000 sword intent bloomed, and knew from the bottom of his heart that there was no possibility of the big-belly Buddha surviving. When all the sword intent dissipated and the dust fell on the bone road, the miserable scene was immediately reflected in Jian Wushuang's eyes. Chapter 49-47. The godlike celestial body of the Big Belly Buddha has been shattered and shattered by the sword intent. The endless blood of God was almost forming a river on the bone road, and everything in sight was full of misery. Jian Wushuang took advantage of his strength and awakened all the sword intent on this white bone road, so that he could easily defeat the Big Belly Buddha with the strength of rank 6 Dayan Immortal. If not, it is almost impossible to defeat it. Seeing the immortal corpses all over the floor, Jian Wushuang restrained his mind and prepared to leave. But at this moment, he felt a faint breath again. The breath was faint but real, and very familiar. Jian Wushuang was slightly startled in his heart and looked directly in that direction, only to see a miserable figure among the countless huge corpses, struggling constantly. Impossible, why is he not dead yet? He thought, hurried back to the wreckage of the Big Belly Buddha. Waved his palms flying the huge remains of the corpse, a bloody, extremely skinny figure came into his eyes. Ahem. I am finally relieved. The extremely skinny figure lay on the bone road soaked in the blood of the gods, with a voice of relief from his mouth. Jian Wushuang frowned slightly. From the clothes on his body, it could be seen that it was a worn-out Zen clothing, and there was a huge Zen beads hanging around his neck. This kind of dress, Jian Wushuang had seen it once in this great development. Even the group of great monks who destroyed the heaven where the sand demon cave is located are dressed in this way. Little is known about the origin of the group of great monks, only that they come from outside the Big Division territory and are extremely terrifying existence. There were many great monks who entered the sand demon cavern, but only the empty will left Jian Wushuang the deepest impression. And this skinny figure now seems to be related to the group of great monks long ago. Could it be that he also came from the so-called world of heavenly Buddha? Jian Wushuang thought to himself, condensing an invisible sword in his hand. Ahem. The skinny figure opened his mouth and vomited a big mouthful of blood, and then collapsed on his back. Only then did Jian Wushuang see his face clearly. His face was clear and thin, like an ascetic monk. With his eyes facing each other, the monk, who was already angry, suddenly got up with all his strength and knelt down facing him. Thank you, the good man gave me relief, I can't repay the song. Jian Wushuang didn't reply, stared at him without any relaxation, and finally said slowly, where did you come from and why are you here? With a light cough, the monk who claimed to be Xingge sat cross-legged on the road of white bones with his hands clasped together. Since the monk asked about it, Xingge will tell the reason for this. My original song came from the world of Tongtian Buddhism. I am an ascetic monk who travels in the realm of 10,000 realms and feels all kinds of suffering. Hearing this sentence, Jian Wushuang's divine mind was a little shaken. Just as he had imagined, this monk also came from the world of Tongtian Buddha. The monk named Xingge continued to say to himself, and the reason why I am here is purely because of that battle. That was the battle to destroy the old age and establish a new heaven. All living creatures fell in that battle, and the heavenly domains that belonged to the old heaven also fell. Not only did the heaven fall, but even the strongest among them died, but the strong died, but the strongest ones were not beheaded. The strongest people have been banished to a tangible and intangible, intangible and intangible place. As for that place, it is here, Xingge said, and pointed his thin palm to the ground. And I traveled there, that is, the big division area that was suggested later, was inadvertently involved in that war, and was eventually banished here for various reasons. Jian Wushuang heard this and said again, then why did you become the same as before? Xingge heard the words, 2 lines of clear tears welled up from the dilapidated eye sockets, and finally he said, greed, I relied on myself and rejected the 6 desires, but finally did not escape the control of greed. After I was banished, my mind was wounded, and then occupied by the emperor, which evoked the ultimate greed in my heart, and became a bad Buddha. If it weren't for the good men to come here and eventually destroy my evil body, I'm afraid I am trapped here forever. This short conversation was completely over. Jian Wushuang also got some secrets from Xingge's words. These Dayan immortals exiled in the Sea of No Edge were the strongest people in the original heavenly courts before Zhen Wuyang created the heavenly courts. And this is somewhat different from Jian Wushuang's guess. He thought that the exiled here were some extremely evil Dayan immortals. The song puts hands together, and there is relief in the dead eyes. Thank you, good man, Shinga has been liberated, but when I am about to be liberated, I want to give the good man something." As he said, his skinny palm touched the string of ring beads between his neck, and then took off the fist-sized ring beads in the middle. In an instant, all the ring beads on his neck were turned into nothingness, only the one in his hand exuded a mysterious color. Seeing such a ring bead, Jian Wushuang remembered another thing. Under the sea of blood in the Sand Demon Cavern, he had visited the empty chakra, and in the end he also gave him a natal ring. "Good man, the song has nothing to do with it. Give this ring to the good man." Jian Wushuang did not shirk off. After a little thought, he reached out and took the ring beads in his hand. The ring beads are warm and cool and have a unique texture. Afterwards, Jian Wushuang said, "Do you know there is an ascetic monk named Kongluan?" The line song that was about to fall, after hearing the name taboo, his eyes suddenly opened to the maximum. Empty wheel? My brother, his name is Empty Wheel. Good people have seen him. How good is he? Jian Wushuang sighed secretly in his heart. And then slowly said, "We have met before, and we have been discussing the forum for a few days, and it is very close. He is also an ascetic who measures the earth with his feet. I'm afraid he has passed away." Shinga shook his whole body, leaving 2 lines of clear tears in his eyes again, and did not make any excessive actions. After a while, he whispered, "It's fine, it's time for me." As his voice fell, the thin fairy body returned directly to nothingness, flowing out of the stars, and finally all scattered on this bone road. A rank 6 Dian fairy fell. Jian Wushuang was silent, looking at the black ring bead in his hand, and threw it into the Bo Yang bottle. The death of Shinga didn't touch him too much. What he was thinking now was how to quickly leave this boneless road. Here, it's not as quiet as he imagined. It is very possible that a rank 6 Dian immortal is just the beginning. In the back, perhaps the most mysterious existence of Baigulu. Chapter 49-48. With the fall of the big-bellied Buddha and Zingis sitting and passing away, the road to the bones became unimpeded again, and the front was revealed in Jian Wushuang's eyes. Containing his mind, he continued to walk forward firmly. The road to the bones is endless, and the road to the foot has an end. Jian Wushuang's feet stepped on the sword intent for millions of miles. Under this sea of blood, running freely on the road of bones, no immortal could stop him. Leaving the realm of the original Big Belly Buddha, the wicked and greedy meaning in the bone road ahead disappeared, replaced by the aura of ancient prohibition, full of unknown. At the same time, the road of the bones under the feet began to turn grey-black, and most of the scattered bones were intact. They seemed to wake up at any time when they fell asleep. Jian Wushuang's heart rose with a sense of vigilance, and at the same time, he directly condensed the overflowing power, and swept forward with the whole body sword intent. A withered and cold aura quietly surged from the whole body, very strange and somewhat familiar. In the next moment, a ray of extreme cold light suddenly bloomed from the road of bones, and instantly shot Jian Wushuang directly. He had been alert for a long time, with 5 fingers, and suddenly shot a Yanli Huamang. Boom! When Yanli Huamang wiped out the extreme cold glow at Nirvana, he blasted towards the bone road and directly set off a wave of dust. What exudes the extreme cold glow is a pitch-black fairy bone holding a real sword. While Jian Wushuang destroyed him, his figure didn't stop, and he shot straight ahead. But everything has changed. As he walked forward, the tens of thousands of feet of dust slowly came to an end, and then countless rays of dark red light burst out. The fairy bones lying on their backs on the road of white bones all recovered at this moment, and their empty eye sockets were now replaced by the dark red dead light. Kill. At the forefront of the revived bone army, a white bone that resembled a sacred peak was several tens of feet high. He held a broken real sword and pointed straight at Jian Wushuang in front of him. In the next moment, all the bones swarmed forward, terrifying to the extreme. Jian Wushuang secretly said something bad. Looking at the army of white bones behind him, he realized something. The bones in this new round of resuscitation carried a deadly energy that was extremely heavy, just like the dead immortal in the dead immortal domain where the cloud was located. They barely retained some consciousness, desperately eager for the power of evolving immortals, and there is a source of immortality in their bodies that is about to be broken. Their strength is not to be underestimated, and it is extremely tricky. Right now, this army of dead immortals is endless. If Jian Wushuang doesn't escape as soon as possible, I'm afraid he will be besieged. However, the energy bursting out of these dead immortals was far beyond his imagination. Almost at the same time, just like the Tianhe swept across, these dead immortal armies that still preserved their respective immortal sources have been besieged from all sides to Jian Wushuang. Damn, what are these things? He was astonished, and at the same time released 1,000,000 sword intent without hesitation. But the thing that surprised him was still behind. These dead immortals who chased him would actually avoid sword intent instead of letting them be slaughtered. For a time, 1,000,000 sword intents had little effect, and they barely stopped it for a while. After killing thousands of dead immortals, they couldn't stop it. With the weird sound resounding, dark red light beams rushed out from the bones of each dead immortal, forming a cobweb-like sky and earth net and pressing against Jian Wushuang. The space seemed to freeze, he couldn't escape, and was immediately covered by the net that day. At the same time, the dead immortal army all gathered around, besieging Jian Wushuang in the center. Click. Accompanied by the stiff and twisting sound of the joints, the army of the dead immortals automatically gave way. Immediately afterwards, a huge fairy bone measuring tens of meters walked towards Jian Wushuang. His whole body was filled with boundless power, which was terrifying to the extreme. With eyes facing each other, the huge dead bones raised the broken true sword in his hand, and the tip of the sword pointed at him. "I want to fight you." The hoarse and ethereal voice resounded from the mouth of the huge dead fairy. Jian Wushuang looked at him without saying a word, directly condensing an invisible sword. "If you lose, your immortal source belongs to me, and the soul becomes a slave to this seat." The dead immortal bone said in a deep voice, then he stretched out his palm, tore open the net of heaven and earth, and walked in. Facing the death immortal who was as high as tens of meters and was like a peak, Jian Wushuang did not care. Although dead immortal is weaker than Yangxian Du, the huge bones of dead immortal are not like ordinary Yangxian. Although he is also a skeletal bone, outside the skeletal bone, it is wrapped with hundreds of millions of threads of force, and it does not look much different from the ordinary fairy body. When a dark red light wheel appeared behind him, Jian Wushuang secretly said a bad sound. The light wheel condenses, it is the 6th revolution. Once it reaches the 6th rank, Dianxian will completely reach its peak. Although Jian Wushuang was able to fight Dian Immortal, he had no choice but to run away from rank 6 Dian Immortal. As the dead bones showed their strength, Jian Wushuang was inevitable, and the invisible sword in his hand pointed forward. "Xiao Xiao Yangxian, you can't help yourself," Dead Immortal Skeleton said angrily, and then he started directly. The broken sword in his hand suddenly plunged into the bone road on the ground. Afterwards, the extremely violent sword intent tore through the road of the bones, like several dormant real dragons, all rushing towards Jian Wushuang. A section of Baigu Road was shattered, rolling up the dust. Seeing this situation, Jian Wushuang suddenly jumped into the air, holding up the invisible sword in his hand, and crushing it down. Ten Dao surging up with sword intent enveloping thousands of immortal bones, rushing forward. When the two collided, the entire road of bones shook in an instant. Under the shock of this huge force, the huge dead fairy bone holding the real sword involuntarily retreated a few steps. An unmatched Huamang shattered the sword intent carrying the fairy bones from beginning to end. Then Jian Wushuang floated to the ground, his robe was not stained with dust. The light ball in the eye socket of the dead immortal's bone flickered twice. Yu read the book www.ukanshu.com and then he held the true sword high and ran towards Jian Wushuang. Bai Bone Road trembled, and his heart moved slightly. In the previous match, he felt that although the dead fairy bones could still condense the light wheel, their strength had already declined to the extreme. The bones of the dead immortal now have only rank 3 strength at most. After feeling this change, Jian Wushuang decided to fight quickly. With a wave of his hand, the heaven gate of the ancestral technique power realm appeared. Then a giant finger from the sky directly covered the skeleton of the dead fairy. Seeing the Huamang blooming above his head, the bones of the dead immortal raised their sword and stabbed them up. Rumble. The sky-reaching giant finger was directly smashed by the stabbing, and while dropping the endless tassels, it blocked all sight. "It's now!" Jian Wushuang screamed, his figure turned into a blue sword light, and he thrust forward. Chapter 49-49. This is actually happening too fast. When the huge dead fairy bones recovered, Jian Wushuang, who turned into a sword light, has quietly arrived in front of him. The eyes burst out with cold light, the invisible sword in Jian hands had already bloomed, and the tip of the sword then pierced forward. In the most central position is the source of the dead bones. As long as the invisible sword can penetrate, Jian Wushuang can release 1,000,000 sword intent in an instant, smashing it completely. But the next moment, the sudden change occurred. When the tip of the sword was only an inch away from the source of the dead fairy bone, 2 huge white bone fingers clamped his sword blade, and then smashed him out. Back hundreds of feet, Jian Wushuang was shocked. He had never expected that the dead fairy bones would react so quickly. Pushing him back, the bones of the dead immortal made a deep sound, and then again held the sword to cut forward. Facing the huge broken blade, Jian Wushuang also raised his sword to respond. Zheng. Zheng's sword intent is vertical and horizontal, rushing for millions. The white bone road trembled, and once again stirred up a wave of dust. The sound of golden and iron strikes resounded through this entire road of bones, and the army of the dead immortals surrounding the sky and the earth, all waved their true swords in their hands at this moment, and screamed loudly. "Kill, kill!" At this moment, Jian Wushuang, who was fighting against the dead fairy bones, was more and more shocked. Facing the sword intent of a sword surpassing a sword, the bones of the dead immortal, which was as large as a god, not only did not feel heavier, but became lighter and lighter. She was able to calmly accept the sword intent cut by Jian Wushuang. This is not a reaction at all. Yangxian, who has not been exposed to kendo, can react. At this moment, Jian Wushuang had already had a doubt in his heart. Could it be that this 6th-rank Dayan immortal also practiced kendo during his lifetime? The battle was still going on, and if Wushuang kendo was not released, Jian Wushuang could not help him for a while. Just as Jian Wushuang was about to release Wushuang's swordsmanship, the dead fairy bones that had been silent suddenly spoke at this moment. "Are you a swordsman?" The hoarse voice was like a big palm, plucking the string in Jian Wushuang's heart. He moved intentionally and asked, "Are you also a swordsman?" There was no answer, but the cheeks of the dead fairy's bones followed with an expression of unknown meaning. "Unexpectedly, in this dusty place, I would still meet a living swordsman. Before I was exiled, there were fewer than 10 Yangxian who could be called a swordsman in my long life. Now I have seen a real swordsman. Heaven treats me not badly." When he said this, Yijian forced Jian Wushuang back, and then stood still. "I am also a swordsman, but that is a long time ago, and you can count as one who can make me call a swordsman." Jian Wushuang heard the words and didn't comment, but the invisible sword in his hand was still gaining momentum. "Now, let's use the swordsman's way to solve it. Maybe the moment I can break through to the sword fairy will appear on you," said the dead bones, the broken real sword in his hand pressed down, and the blade pointed directly at Jian Wushuang. When Jian Wushuang heard his last words, the corners of his mouth curled up, and then said loudly, "You are still a long distance away from Zhenxian, like a moat. Then there are only 2 ways to go today. I will break through the sword fairy, or be killed by you." The dead fairy bones said in a deep voice. The real sword in his hand was severely cut at this moment. The bone road at the foot was also ploughed into a deep gully under this blow. "Sword of the great Tianhe," he said in a deep anger. The broken blade exploded out of the most brilliant sword at this moment, and a mighty glowing shadow surged from his true sword. Space was oppressed, and the net of heaven and earth was shattered under this sword. Under this sword, Jian Wushuang felt the depression of the sacred mountain. This sword is enough to be a real swordsman. Jian Wushuang's eyes were solemn, and the invisible sword in his hand also blossomed. Wushuang Kendo Xingyihu Haijianyi, the 2nd style. River. The towering Tianhe came from the sky, and the broken void came. The hundreds of millions of swordsmanship team is Tianhe, magnificent to the extreme. At this moment, the 2 heavenly rivers collided, blooming the most magnificent scene on the bone road. After seeing this scene, the army of dead immortals who had surrounded them all retreated wildly with tacit understanding. But it was too late. The two heavenly rivers collided, and the terrible situation that broke out swept everything. There was a dead fairy who ran slowly, and was involved in it on the spot and turned into a fan. Under the shining of this sword light, the dead immortal bones subconsciously covered his eyes, and then his figure was swallowed by the sword light. At this moment, the infinite sword intent replaced Yanli, completely swallowing everything. This sword intent confrontation lasted for a long time, until nearly 10,000 feet of bones were turned into dust, and when all the dust settled, Sword Tianhe ended. Dust will go to silence, everything will go to dust. Jian Wushuang's figure appeared on the broken bones road covered with fairy bone dust. Under the whiteness of the sky and the dust, he was the only one in his black clothes that was not contaminated with dust. And in front of him, 10 feet away, stood the bones of dead immortals dozens of feet high. The broken true sword in his hand was finally completely shattered, without even leaving the hilt, and his pupils were dim and dying. You broke my kendo. Yes, but I can only do this. Jian Wushuang said slowly, and some fluctuations flashed in his eyes. Is that the real kendo just now? The bones of the dead immortal stared at him, trying to find the answer. And Jian Wushuang didn't conceal it, and said, that is my kendo, the kendo that I understand. I really didn't expect that I could fight against a real swordsman when I became this appearance. I am already satisfied, said the dead fairy skeleton, you are not a swordsman. Jian Wushuang heard the words, did not speak, whether he was a swordsman, did not need to be judged by others. After the dead fairy bone said the last sentence, he immediately said, you have exceeded the scope of a swordsman, you are a sword fairy. I have no regrets to be able to see Jiangxian's sword. Jian Wushuang raised his brows slightly, it was not like a strong person, the extremely proud rank 6 Dian immortal could say. After the bones of the dead immortal had finished speaking, they seemed to be satisfied, and the flowing fairy source in his immortal body also quietly shattered at this moment. The fragmentation of Xianyuan was not due to his willingness, but in the previous fights, Jian Wushuang's sword rushed to the Xianyuan of the dead fairy bones. Once the source of the fairy is broken, even the Dian immortal can only fall, and the bones of the dead immortal that have died once are no exception. Chapter 4950. As the Xianyuan shattered, the dead fairy bones knelt heavily on the broken bones road, and the huge bone palms waved in the air, seeming to want to keep the disappearing Xianyuan. Jian Wushuang, who stood in front of him, watched this scene calmly, and then dispersed the invisible sword in his hand. I'm going to die. The bones of the dead immortal whispered softly, but when the deathlight in his eyes was about to die, it suddenly brightened again, as if returning to the light. Although you are a sword immortal, there is a sword immortal on this road. I am looking forward to your battle, but I can't see it anymore. Their swordsmanship is even stronger than you. You won't be able to win so easily. After speaking these last words, the bones of the dead immortal fell completely, as if the peak of the gods were shattered, his bones were completely shattered into powder and could no longer recover. Standing on this slowly healing white bone road, Jian Wushuang was silent, although his face was calm, his heart was already shaking. In the road to the bones, there is actually a sword fairy? Such a news shocked Jian Wushuang far more than any news. In all fairness, a sword immortal is an unimaginable existence. But in Jian Wushuang's current knowledge, only Ding Baiyi can be called a true sword fairy. Even Jian Wushuang himself didn't agree that he was a sword immortal. He had an intuition that he could only fight Ding Baiyi completely after the Wushuang Kendo and the last sword intent of Xinggehuhai sword intent. Only then can he be called a sword fairy. But right now, the Dian immortal, who can be called the sword immortal by the bones of the dead immortal, is definitely a terrifying existence. Jian Wushuang's head is a little big when he thinks of this. What terrible existence is still trapped in this white bone road? Just as he was lost in thought, the dead immortals who had disappeared quietly recovered at this moment. A dark red death light burst from their eyes. Damn, haven't these things been dispelled? Jian Wushuang was startled secretly, and then ran without thinking. Although he is not afraid of the army of dead immortals, it is extremely wrong to make unnecessary consumption. As a result, in the next period of time, you can see that an arrogant figure is rushing across the road, and behind him are countless army of dead immortals. The White Bone Road is endless, and it has become more broad and mighty in the continuous advancement. It's like a Wangu battlefield that has experienced a miserable battle. There are broken bones everywhere, the most precious treasure without Lingyun, the broken true sword. It is extremely miserable. Jian Wushuang, who had been scouring at high speed, looked at the dead immortal army getting closer and closer behind him, and couldn't help but rise in anger in his heart. Just when he was about to destroy everything, the road to the bones underneath him trembled, as if something was waking up. "Excuse me to sleep, I see you little bugs, you really are too long." A lazy and faintly angry voice, as if resounding from the 9 heavens. Then the next moment, the clear sound of a long sword being unsheathed quietly sounded on the Wangu battlefield. With the clear sound of the long sword being unsheathed, the army of the dead immortals who had been chasing Jian Wushuang frantically all fled frantically. But it was too late. The sword curtain rose quietly, like a million meteors falling, causing the entire dark red void to tremble. Endless void, hundreds of thousands of miles of bones, all covered by the sword curtain. Every sword intent that formed the sword curtain was full of calm and endless meaning. Although it seemed peaceful, it made everything lose its color. Under the shroud of this shooting star sword curtain, none of the dead immortals survived. They died so simply that Jian Wushuang couldn't believe it. The infinite sword intent was finally desolate, and all the dead immortals standing in place were crushed. On the Wangu battlefield, dust is filled. But Jian Wushuang, who was in the center of the sword curtain, did not feel any fluctuations. This ability to control the sword intent was terrifying to the extreme. Jian Wushuang stood in place, ready to condense sword intent between his palms. But at the same time, an icy breath appeared behind him. "Hey Junior, don't try to draw the sword, your speed will never be faster than mine, you can try if you don't believe me." A wisp of cold sweat flowed from Jian Wushuang's temples and could come to his back silently, which already explained the problem. Immediately afterwards, the originally silent void suddenly surged with a layer of ripples, and then a figure walked out of the ripples. At this moment, Jian Wushuang's eyes opened to the fullest. The person who came was a woman of extreme heroism. The long and narrow willow eyebrows flew diagonally into the temples, a pair of eye-catching eyes to the extreme, and the embroidered red belt that held the long hair behind him also swayed with the wind. She wore a black and gold uniform with a pair of breasts, and 6 long swords slung across her waist. "This is a swordsman." She walked down from the void and stood on the Fang Wangu battlefield, looking at Jian Wushuang with her extremely heroic eyes, revealing a somewhat intriguing look. Looking at the 6 long swords slung around her waist, Jian Wushuang couldn't help swallowing his throat. There is a tiger watching before and a wolf watching behind. He caught in the middle is afraid that today is in danger. As time passed by, Jian Wushuang did not dare to move. After a long time, the heroic woman who straddled the 6 long swords suddenly said, "This junior is very good." Immediately afterwards, the mysterious figure behind him also spoke, "It is indeed very good, the concentration is extremely stable, and it is a great talent." When the heroic woman heard the words, she raised her eyes and said coldly, "Since you are a great talent, what are you doing squatting behind him? Are you planning to kill him?" As the words fell, the aura behind Jian Wushuang disappeared suddenly, and then a figure appeared in front of the heroic woman. "Well, I'm just used to it. I can't bear to kill such talented juniors. Keep them for great use." At this time Jian Wushuang saw that figure. He was also a very heroic middle-aged man, with a clean face and no need, but he looked like a bright star, but with a bit of laziness. On his waist, there were 6 long swords, no more, no less. Facing the heroic woman, the middle-aged man's face was full of unconcealable smiles. "No, these 2 swordsmen are not sword lovers, right?" Jian Wushuang felt a little big head, and it seemed that these 2 swordsmen might indeed be sword lovers. "I'm afraid that next, he wants to escape from here, it will not be so easy. This junior is really good. I saw his kendo before. It is very photogenic. It can destroy the source of a 6th rank Dian immortal." The heroic woman said slowly, while the middle-aged man's smile gradually disappeared after hearing her narration, and finally he was extremely solemn. Chapter 4951. How strong is the kendo that can destroy the fairy source of the 6th rank Dian Immortal? And how strong is the guy who can use this kendo? In other words, it was this junior who caused the shock on the road to the bones, the middle-aged man asked slowly. The heroic woman nodded immediately. Yes, I just witnessed the battle, it was exciting enough. If it is him, it seems that it's time for me to wake up. The middle-aged man looked at Jian Wushuang, his mouth slowly conjured up a smile. Jian Wushuang unconsciously felt a cold behind him. He could feel these two sword companions, although they did not show any strength, they were definitely more terrifying than rank 6 Dian Immortal. Thinking of this, he suddenly realized something. The bones of the dead immortal said before his death that there were sword immortals on the road of white bones. Are these two swordsmen the sword immortals? That big guy still had a barely enough strength before his death. Now his strength after death is no more than 3 ranks. It is not impossible to be beheaded by a powerful swordsman. It just makes me a little curious. The heroic woman paused at this point and looked at Jian Wushuang with interest. Junior, which sword is your own kendo? Jian Wushuang heard the words and nodded after a little thought. Yes. If you really created it yourself, the future achievements are immeasurable. The heroic woman said, and then stretched out her palm to flick in the air. In an instant, a picture scroll appeared in this chaotic void. Jian Wushuang saw this scene, his pupils suddenly shrank. In that picture scroll is actually the battle between him and the dead bones. In the picture scroll, the Tianhe River turns, and the bones of the dead immortal are finally penetrated by the Tianhe Xianyuan, all kinds of kneeling sitting on the bone road. Jian Wushuang never expected that the scene of the fight between them would be completely rubbed out. This heroic woman is definitely an extraordinary swordsman. When the picture scroll finally dissipated, the middle-aged man looked at Jian Wushuang, his eyes bright. Sure enough, it's really strong. I'm in love with this junior. Come on, junior, fight with me for 3 rounds. I haven't seen such a good piece in a long time. Jian Wushuang's eyes twitched slightly, looking at the extremely excited middle-aged man, then he said, I'm afraid it won't work. I strayed into this place. I need to leave here as soon as possible. If I consume too much, I'm afraid I will become passive on the next journey. Up. Hearing this, the middle-aged man raised his eyebrows and said, it turns out that you are going on your way. That would be easier. If you walk 3 rounds under my hands, we will let you go all the way. If you avoid, I'm afraid it's hard to say if I fight. He said, patted the 6 long swords on his waist. Jian Wushuang felt that the battles were big, and he could feel that these 2 invisible sword companions were definitely more terrifying than they showed. It does not seem to be a simple matter to last 3 rounds. How are you thinking about it? The middle-aged man raised his eyebrows and said with a meaningful smile. After a short period of thought, Jian Wushuang replied, come on, let's talk first. I only need to last 3 rounds and you will let me go. Happy. The middle-aged man laughed loudly and flew directly to Jian Wushuang. The hem of the black gold gown floated in the wind, and his right hand was pressed on the hilt of the 6-handed long sword at his waist, unspeakably wanton. And Jian Wushuang did not hesitate at all, an invisible sword condensed directly in his palm. Seeing this scene, the middle-aged man's eyes lit up again, invisible and innocent, using kendo as a sword. Juniors, you are bold. He immediately said, don't dare to say, the saber was destroyed, so I can only do this. The Tai Luo divine sword was destroyed by Ding Beichun, which was the fundamental reason why Jian Wushuang condensed the invisible sword. The middle-aged man smiled and stopped speaking, nodding slightly. My name is Yang Fan, and that woman is my wife, named Jiang Li. Jian Wushuang immediately arched his hands. Jian Wushuang. Sword warriors, good meaning, let's start. As the voice fell, the entire Wangu battlefield was silent. The middle-aged man named Yang Fan didn't seem to want to take the lead, but just looked at him with a smile. Jian Wushuang converged his mind and competed purely in kendo. He was not afraid. What he was thinking about was how to draw 3 styles in the next fight. At the next moment, Jian Wushuang moved, like a thunderous force, and his sword was swung to its extreme speed. The sharp and unmatched blade slashed straight towards Yang. This unremarkable sword, Even Dianxian did not dare to underestimate it. But then, a shocking scene appeared. Facing this sword, Yang Fan stood in place without evasiveness, then raised the middle of his right hand to clamp the invisible sword that was slashing down. The invisible sword that was transformed by Wushuang's sword's props was actually caught by at this moment. Jian Wushuang's pupils shrank, and he found that the invisible sword could hardly advance even more. The power is not small, but it is too impetuous, and it is easy to see the flaws. Yang Fan said with a smile, and then pushed it away. After stepping back several feet, Jian Wushuang was completely solemn, and Yang Fan, who did not show any signs of dew, was like the sacred peak of Yuanzhuyu at this moment, making it impossible to guess what he was going to do next. Yang Fan still had a smile on his face, pressing his right hand on the hilt of his waist, and walking slowly to Jian Wushuang. Come again. Jian Wushuang converged his mind and prepared to compete again. But this time, he just raised the invisible sword in his hand and received a head-on blow. Yang Fan's right hand, which was holding the hilt around his waist, suddenly picked up, and a long sword was directly unsheathed. With the hilt as the head, carrying infinity, it instantly hit Jian Wushuang's chest. Boom! All this happened so quickly that when Jian Wushuang reacted, everything was over. He only felt that his chest was about to break. His figure retreated dozens of feet before he could digest the huge force. The unsheathed long sword returned to its sheath, as if nothing had happened. Yang Fan still looked at Jian Wushuang with a smile, always in an unhurried appearance. Rubbing his aching chest, Jian Wushuang gritted his teeth secretly. It was only these two fights that he fell into a passive state, almost suppressed by Yang Fan. While this made him depressed, he also had a certain understanding of Yang Fan. From the moment I practiced swordsmanship, I just took the action of unscathing, and I trained for a Chinese year. During that Chinese year, I only tried to maximize the speed of unscathing. In order to get a chance. So far, no one Yangxian can stop me from getting out of the sheath. Yang Fan blinked. Well, are you interested in learning to practice swords with me? When Jian Wushuang heard the words, he couldn't help but confuse himself. Chapter 4952. It's just an unimaginable thing to practice for a whole Chinese year with just an unsheathing action. You must know that one Chinese year is equivalent to 10 times in the universe. After 10 times of cosmic reincarnation, only repeating something that even a 3-year-old child can do, such perseverance can no longer be described in any language. Even Jian Wu couldn't imagine how stubborn it would be to do so. He has only practiced for only a few tens of thousands of years, and he sincerely admires this old monster who has been practicing for a long time. Faced with Yang Fan's invitation, Jian Wushuang could only smile and shook his head. Then he asked, "Are you a sword fairy?" Yang Fan raised his eyebrows and smiled. Naturally, not only I am a sword fairy, but my wife is also a sword fairy. A pair of swordsmen, 2 swordsmen. Jian Wushuang smiled bitterly. When he learned that these two were real sword immortals, he knew why Yang Fan had made the 3 swords agreement before. This is the meaning of point to point. Once you step into the realm of sword fairy, you are basically at the absolute top. The heavenly immortal Ding Baiyi was the first sword immortal Jian Wushuang knew. The pair of swordsmen, Jiang Li and Yang Fan, were the other 2 sword immortals he met. Sword immortal and swordsman are fundamentally different, and Wushuang Kendo does not have a mellow Jian Wushuang, and it is not a sword immortal. Junior, come up with some real skills, let me take a good look at it, whether it's scary after all. Yang Fan patted the hilt and said loudly, and Jian Wushuang, at this moment, all condensed the overflowing aura. His whole body shape was like a real sword with hidden front waiting to be activated. Shu Orfeng lightly rises, causing a ripple in the void. In the next moment, he quietly opened his eyes and shot out 10,000 strands of cold light. No self is added. Wushuang Kendo, Xingyihu Haijianyi, the first style. Star. Without any fancy sword slashed straight out, the entire void was shaken by it. Yang Fan, who was still smiling, reduced his smile at this moment, pressed the palm of the hilt, and quietly clenched it. The incomparably violent star-shaped sword intent shattered the void and swallowed it forward with an endless momentum, and all voids along the way burst out of 10,000 feet of awning pillar. This style of sword intent is too magnificent and magnificent, as if the world has been swallowed. Facing this pose, Yang Fan quietly drew a snowflake-long sword from the 6 longswords on his waist. Then, holding a long sword in both hands, he cut a cross in front of his eyes. The void was chopped to pieces. The next moment, the violent star-shaped sword intent was cut open with a cross, turning into 4 rushing rivers and exploding in the void. And Yang Fan, who was in the most center, was unscathed, and the corners of his clothes were not broken. The violent sword intent wind blew the tips of his hair. Other than that, there was no fluctuation. When the sword intent completely dissipated, Jian Wushuang could not help but smile wryly when he saw Yang Fan without any damage. Couldn't even Wushuang Kendo have any influence on him? Holding a sword flower with the long sword in his hand, and then retightening the sheath, Yang Fan smiled and looked at Jian Wushuang. If I guess right, this sword is the beginning of the previous one. Jian Wushuang nodded, and being able to guess the connection between the sword intents was enough to see his horror. Yang Fan continued, very good, as the beginning of a kendo, it has such a powerful force, it is the only thing I have seen in my life. This first formula, if you have passed the level, there will be 2 following formulas, it depends on your good fortune. He said that the entire spilled breath was restrained at this moment. The snowflake long sword that had been sheathed by him was drawn out again, and the sharp point of the sword pointed towards Jian Wushuang. A great crisis surging from the bottom of his heart, he directly raised the invisible sword to deal with it without even thinking about it. At this moment, the originally broken void quietly reflected infinite coldness. The sword curtain, like a ripple, covered the entire void. This is the real sword of Jian Xian. This sword directly killed the army of 100,000 dead immortals before. Countless true swords formed an endless sword curtain. If this formula is completely settled, Jian Wushuang will inevitably be hit hard. Facing this sword curtain, Jian Wushuang's divine mind was rapidly turning. When the sword curtain fell, the void couldn't bear the surge of sword intent, and became fragmented. The heroic woman who was watching this scene from afar, Jiang Li, had a solemn gaze, her palms pressed against the hilt of her waist, as if she was ready to help at any time. Although Jian Wushuang's stunning performance made her admire her, Jiang Li didn't think Jian Wushuang could resist this sword on his own. As a sword companion, she was extremely convinced that Yang Fan's sword was terrifying. Therefore, Jiang Li is ready to take in Jian Wushuang at any time. The emptiness is brilliant, the sword curtain falls suddenly, and the infinite sword intent is enough to easily defeat the heavens. Facing the infinite sword curtain rising from the sky, Jian Wushuang, who was in the most center, suddenly opened his eyes at this moment. A green sword intent different from the previous Wushuang swordsmanship rose from his feet. If the Wushuang Kendo represents magnificence and Lingran Wushuang, then this green sword intent is the meaning of vigor, rebirth, and tenacity. Even Yang Fan, who saw this scene, was puzzled. He could feel that this sword intent was completely different from Jian Wushuang's previous sword intent. It was a brand new sword intent. Could it be that this junior has realized another kind of kendo? No one answered him. At this moment, Jian Wushuang's body was completely enveloped by the emerald sword intent. The blades of grass also rotate, soft and tough. Even his pupils are full of green. Flowing cloud grass sword style. 8th formula. Eyebrow cut in 4 seasons. Swordsmanship is at its ultimate level, and everything can be used as a sword. A lion grass and a willow branch are enough to release the sword. The infinite sword intent turns into green grass leaves, rising from the sky, as if spring flowers are approaching. The whole spectrum of Luyun grass sword style, the first 6 styles are simple, and the last 3 are complex. And Maizhong 4 seasons is also the most terrifying style in the entire spectrum of Luyun grass sword style. You can see the main road in the end. The infinite green grass blades turned into a true sword, standing in the sword curtain under the pressure of the cover. The two collided and the most terrifying scene broke out. The grass sword composed of green sword intent began to shatter under the pressure of the sword curtain. The sword curtain collapsed, the grass sword shattered, and the entire bone battlefield was plunged into a huge earthquake. Looking at the grass sword that was about to break, Jian Wushuang's calm face showed no fluctuations, as if he were not worried at all. Jiang Li also rushed over at this moment, his expression a little worried, and he was ready to shoot the beads to prevent the imminent tragedy. At the same time, she looked sullen and looked at Yang Fan and couldn't help but reproach, "You fellow, don't you know the severity of the attack?" Chapter 4953. At this time, Yang Fan turned a deaf ear to Jiang Li's reproach, and stared solemnly at everything that happened in the sword curtain. For a long time, he said in a somewhat uncertain tone, "This junior seems to have broken my sword." Jiang Li, who was about to wave his hand to prevent the tragedy from happening, stopped in the air with his palms after hearing these words, turned his head and said, "What did you say?" "This junior seems to be breaking my sword." As if to prove his idea, the grass sword, which was originally fragmented and about to be unable to hold on, stopped being broken and began to gather quickly. In the next moment, the almost broken grass sword resurfaced, and the sword power became more powerful, with a tough and majestic momentum, and once again pierced the sky full of swords. Boom! Just as the heavens collapsed, the earth fell, and everything fell into destruction. This was the final collision of the two supreme sword intents, so that Yang Li was eclipsed at this moment. This slaying explosion, which was severe enough to destroy the bone road, lasted a long time. When the infinite sword curtain was all shattered, and the incomparable green sword intent disappeared, a black-robed figure walked out slowly on the broken bones. Jian Wu's double-faced color was still calm, but a bright red appeared at the corner of his mouth. Although he did everything that could happen, he was still traumatized, but fortunately he was right. Liu Yun grass sword style is far less sophisticated, magnificent, and wushuang than wushuang kendo, but at this moment, he succeeded in helping Jian Wushuang win this style. The corners of Jian Wushuang's mouth curled up slightly, and the trauma he suffered in this competition was almost negligible. And all this is because he used the flowing cloud grass sword style. If Jian Wushuang used wushuang swordsmanship, he would certainly be able to take over Yang Fan's full-strength sword, but the price he would suffer would be heavy. Because this is a sword of Zhenxian. The situation that received a heavy price was not something Jian Wushuang would like to see, because the following by Bone Road, once he was depleted, would almost be sentenced to death. Therefore, Jian Wushuang did not choose to fight hard, but used a flowing cloud grass sword to deal with it. From simple to complex flowing clouds and grass sword style, the meaning of kendo is tenacity and new life, which is enough for him to meet with minimal loss. Fortunately, it succeeded. Walking out of the center of the sacrificial explosion, unscathed, even Jian Wushuang, whose robes were not contaminated with half-dust, came to Jiang Lian indifferently. A pair of swordsmen and two sword sages, at this moment, it is worthwhile to recover from the shock. The two of them looked at each other, and then all looked at Jian Wushuang. Being able to take a blow from the sword immortal with the strength of the swordsman, I am afraid that it will not be able to convince Yangxian to reach any heaven. But this scene actually happened. Taking a deep breath, Yang returned, "Junior, your appearance is beyond our expectation. I am afraid that within a year, even if your kendo stops moving forward, it is enough to climb into the realm of Sword Fairy." Jian Wushuang arched his hands and said, "The predecessors are absurdly praised. Repairing the sword is at heart, everything depends on your own good fortune. There is one last sword. If I win, can the two seniors let me go?" Jiang Li and Yang Fan looked at each other, and then a little bit dumbfounded. "Are we so scary, making you reluctant to stay longer?" It's still approachable." Jian Wushuang smiled bitterly, "But I really have something to do. I need to leave here as soon as possible. In that case, if I hinder it any more, it would seem a bit uncomfortable." Yang Fan smiled, "This last sword competition has no meaning anymore. You have already proved it to me." Jian Wushuang heard the words, secretly happy in his heart, and walked out of Zhenxian almost unscathed. This is undoubtedly the best situation. The younger generation thanked you here. Yang Fan nodded with a smile, then took a peek at Jiang Li next to him, and quickly came to Jian Wufang and hugged his shoulder. This move made Jian Wushuang a little confused. Looking at Yang Fan, who was full of ill intentions, he felt a bit cold on his back inexplicably. Senior, you are. Junior. No, brother Jian, do you want to apprentice? Yang Fan cleared his throat and looked at him with expectation and enthusiasm. Jian Wushuang heard the words, suddenly a little dumbfounded, and then said, Senior, I already have a master, I'm afraid it won't work. Yang Fan didn't expect this to be the answer, so he was a little anxious. Little brother, you must know that master can't recognize him randomly. The best match is to find the best match for him. When he said this, he patted his chest with his hand. Little brother, as long as you recognize me as a master, all the lifelong sentiments of my wife and I will be passed on to you, so you can consider it. The two sword immortals approached each other and offered such a tempting condition, which was enough to drive any swordsman in all the heavens into madness. But Jian Wushuang shook his head. Senior, I already have a master, so I really can't. Yang Fan was dumb. He never expected that he would not be able to be a master if he offered such a generous offer. At this moment, Jiang Li quietly appeared behind him and slapped him away. Old guy, how many Chinese years have passed, I'm still so stubborn. Jiang Li yelled, then looked at Jian Wushuang and said, Little guy, you go, see you in the future. Jian Wushuang arched his hands, thank you very much, then. Just when he was about to turn around and leave, Yang Fan's voice rang again, wait a minute. Jian Wushuang stopped, looking helplessly at Yang Fan who was catching up again. Before he could react, Yang Fan directly took his right hand and quickly tapped his on the wrist. Then, a real sword the size of an index finger was printed on his wrist. Jian Wushuang hurriedly retracted his wrist, trying to force this mark with Yanli. You don't have to be in vain, little brother, this mark does no harm to you. It is my sword intent. You can detect where you are. If there is danger, your wife and I will go to rescue the first time. Before he could finish his words, he was slapped and flew out again. Jiang Li's face was full of anger with one hand on his hips. It's really for the old and disrespectful guy, it's nothing but a sword fairy. Jian Wushuang smiled bitterly. He couldn't get rid of it, and it was an incredible thing that he could get two cheap masters for nothing. After silently sympathizing with the beaten Yang returned, he solemnly bid farewell to the two sword immortals, and then proceeded to the end of the road to the bones. Yang Fan, who was still downcast, saw Jian Wushuang leave, and suddenly became alive and well, and ran to Jiang Li excitedly. How is it? How about our apprentice? Chapter 49-54. Jiang Libai glanced at him, did not speak, and said quietly after watching Jian Wushuang's figure completely leave. I can't see through his future, but now I have one thing for sure. Jian Xian will not be his end, but the starting point. Yang Fan took a deep breath after hearing the words. It seems that our apprentice didn't get it in vain. What, your apprentice? Haven't you seen that he has already refused decisively? Jiang Li gave him another blank look and said angrily. He smirked and scratched his head. So what, if you want to be a master, you have to be thick-skinned, and stalking is very necessary. I have already left a mark on him. Can I escape us? The palms of the hands are not in place. Jiang Li looked at Yang Fan, and then at the endless sky. I am afraid that the limit of our life is here. Instead of continuing to sleep under this sea of blood, it is better to leave here and pass on all our swordsmanship. That little guy can take off the burden that master has entrusted to us. Yang Fan nodded and stretched. Indeed, after staying under this sea of blood for too long, the bones are about to rust. It's time to do business. Our swordsmanship is passed on to that kid. It will not be buried. Maybe it will reach another level. So, this little guy, can't let it go. After leaving the two sword immortals, Jian Wushuang let out a sigh of relief after traveling thousands of miles. The sense of oppression that Sword Immortal brought to him was really too great. If the two Sword Immortals were determined to let him leave, then he would never escape. Raising his right hand and looking at the sword-shaped mark on his wrist, Jian Wushuang shook his head helplessly. He restrained his mind and moved on. The road to the bones under the feet seems endless, although after many hardships, there is still no end in sight. This made Jian Wushuang a little depressed at first. If he continues to consume it like this, I am afraid that Di Ching hasn't found it yet, and he will sink into this endless sea. No matter what happens next, he will leave here as fast as possible, leave the so-called Tianlu, and find Diching. Jian Wushuang protects the body. Jian Wushuang swept forward, 1,000,000 miles in a flash. As he continued to move forward, he began to realize that the more the white bone rode, the less restless aura, all the fairy rhyme had disappeared, and even the fairy bone could not become a dead fairy, and the silence was extremely quiet. At the same time, instead of it, pure and strong generative power is flowing. This shocked Jian Wushuang. He had never imagined that under this river of blood, there would be such a strong generative power. At the same time, this made him wary. The subsequent changes in Baigulu also made him vigilant. The flat bones road originally paved by the bones of Yangxian began to appear arcs as they continued to move forward, which was an upward arc like a staircase. Jian Wushuang stopped and looked at the white bone road in front of the ladder. His eyes became serious. There is a hazy layer of faint power on the white bone road of this ladder, which stretches into the boundless void, and in the dark clouds at the end, there is a very vague outline. He muttered to himself again in his heart, and the scene now seemed a bit similar to the heavenly palace on the land and sky. If there were other branches of the white bone road, Jian Wushuang would definitely not be suspected of continuing to move forward, but now there is only one white bone road and can only move on. Taking a deep breath, Jian Wushuang stepped on the ladder. The sole of the foot fell on the first step, and an invisible pressure cover immediately pressed against him. The pressure is intangible and qualitative, as if it is a certain rule, directly suppressed. Jian Wushuang didn't hesitate too much, his footsteps swiftly, his figure moved forward quickly, but it turned out to be 10,000 step. After 10,000 steps, Jian Wushuang stopped his figure, and there were already fine beads of sweat on his temples. The pressure on this ladder is far more terrifying than he imagined, and after a certain number of floors, the pressure will double. At 10,000 ranks, Jian Wushuang, who had already been forced, stopped, as if 1,000,000 sacred mountain covers were pressing on him. Seeing the still endless road ahead, he gritted his teeth and then moved forward again. This time his speed slowed down a lot. 10,000 orders. 30,000 orders. 50,000 orders. 70,000 orders. At this moment, Jian Wushuang was already in a difficult situation, and the power of his meridians had already reached its limit. A lot of sweat evaporates from every pore of his. 80,000 orders. The true shadow of selflessness was directly forced out. With the blessing of the true shadow of Wu Self, Jian Wushuang only felt relaxed all over his body, and he could walk forward quickly. When he reached the 90,000 level, the huge palace that was originally wrapped in black clouds finally appeared. It was a magnificent palace built in the sky, full of endless stern and cold atmosphere. Jian Wushuang has an inexplicable intuition that this heavenly palace is most likely an imperial palace left over from the ancient times. Heaven. Could it be that this is another Tianting site of the past? When he thought of this, Jian Wushuang thought of the former heavenly court of Emperor Liu Crou. In the past, the imperial court meant that opportunities and great crises coexisted. But he didn't have any interest in developing this heavenly court. He had to know that even if the emperor was angry, he could not bear the pressure. But now Jian Wushuang has no way to escape, he can only bite the bullet and head to the former heavenly court. The last 10,000 steps are almost a blend of the first 90,000 steps, and all the pressure is unprecedented. Jian Wushuang almost couldn't hold it even with the addition of Wu Mei Zhanying. He didn't even dare to breathe at will, for fear of being crushed by the terrible pressure of his body. 95,000 steps. 96,000 steps. 98,000 step. At this point, the three avenues of Jian Wushuang were oppress. Wushuang Kendo. Way of protection. The way of killing. The addition of 3 avenues allows him to move forward. 99,900 steps. When he reached the last step, he was already at the end. Every pore is no longer sweat at this moment, is the red blood of God. Divine blood dripped down his robe in front of the heavenly court, and was quickly absorbed. Jian Wushuang, trembling his hands, took out a Di pin pill and stuffed it into his mouth before stopping his injuries. Some broken immortal bodies recovered quickly. Slowly exhaling a turbid breath, Jian Wushuang felt comfortable all over, and the previous fatigue disappeared in a flash. He subconsciously turned his head and looked behind him, but was surprised to find that the white bone road had completely disappeared. As if it had never existed before, there was only an endless void behind him. Taking a deep breath, Jian Wushuang turned and walked towards the endless stern and magnificent heaven. Who dare to trespass into heaven? Outside the heavenly court, a voice resounded through the void in front of the dead giant gate. Chapter 49:55. With the sound of this endless majesty resounding, 2 Dayan immortals holding the halberd tore the void and walked out. 2 3-turn Dayan immortals. Jian Wushuang was alert for an instant, and an invisible sword appeared in his palm. Those who wield the sword into the heavenly court die. The 2 Dayan immortals holding the halberd burst out loud, and the cold light burst into their eyes. In the face of the 2 Tier 3 Dayan immortals, Jian Wushuang was actually still elusive, but at this time he was unavoidable. There was only one battle. The 2 halberds crossed, and an unparalleled giant light burst out instantly. These 2 heavenly court gatekeepers didn't even ask the reason, and directly attacked them. Jian Wushuang had to deal with it. With a slash of the sword's edge, 36,000 sword intents rose, all strangling forward. Jian Wushuang, who has realized his strongest sword intent, has now reached another unprecedented realm in his control of kendo and sword intent. Not only kendo, but also enveloping ancestors and immortal styles are one step closer. If it weren't for the fact that there was no source of immortality, Jian Wushuang was confident that he would be able to climb into the realm of Dayan Immortal as early as after the battle with Zhouqian's Yanjun Chang Duoling. But there is nothing if. Now he is still just the peak of the immortal. However, he is an immortal, but he has the terrifying strength to be able to kill the immortal. Facing the violent cold light, 36,000 sword intent strangling away from all directions. Boom! In front of the heavenly court, the most magnificent martyrdom broke out. The 2 heavenly gatekeepers stepped back together, their eyes became cautious and solemn. Jian Wushuang picked up his long sword and stood still in place, and did not pursue the victory. I have no intention of entering the heavenly court, but this is the only way for me to go out. If you can tell other ways to leave, I will definitely leave. Hearing what he said, the 2 gatekeepers looked at each other, and there was less murderous in their eyes. In the end, an older Dayan immortal stepped forward and said in a deep voice, "You go back, and you will disturb the Emperor's sleep. Once the Emperor wakes up, no one can save you. I don't intend to harass, but this is probably my only way. Only from here can I leave, so I can't retire." Jian Wushuang didn't retreat in the slightest, and said in a solid voice, "Bold, you are a little Yangxian who dare to be so arrogant. Are you not afraid that this seat will kill you on the spot?" The gatekeeper took a step closer again, holding the palm of the halberd as if he was about to kill in the next moment. He still stood there and said quietly, "You can't kill me." Extremely arrogant. The gatekeeper smirked, and the heavenly halberd in his hand was about to smash at Jian Wushuang. However, at this moment, the sudden change occurred. The sky halberd that was raised high lay across Jian Wushuang's head. No matter how hard it was as if some form of invisible heaven had restrained it. Even if his face flushed, he couldn't go any further. Jian Wushuang was also a little strange. He didn't release any power and sword intent to stop him, but the gatekeeper's appearance did not appear to be fake, but was truly restrained. In the next moment, the giant gate of heaven that seemed to have been silent for countless years slowly opened, reflecting the endless glory. The expressions of the 2 gatekeepers changed drastically, and they didn't even think about it. They knelt in front of the heavenly court, not even daring to lift their heads. The brilliance dissipated in an instant, and everything returned to calm. "Come in." A low voice, and with the ethereal voice above the heaven, resounded from the heaven. Jian Wushuang's heart trembled unconsciously. A living emperor? He couldn't believe it. Could it be that an emperor was really sealed off in this endless sea? Suppressing the uncomfortable spirit, Jian Wushuang finally decided to step into the heavenly court. He already had a determined mentality. If the emperor didn't plan to let him go, The big deal would be death, at least he could be reborn in the future. Stepping into the heavenly court, the Wenyu ground beneath her feet quietly lit up, and then illuminated the entire heavenly court. The heaven was vast and empty, there were no mountains and sea pillars listed, there were no case slips seated one by one, and some were just empty. Jian Wushuang was in this heavenly court, inexplicably feeling a chill in his heart. You came. That endless, majestic and ethereal voice resounded in this heavenly court, and he couldn't even notice where the voice came from for a while. You are the first visitor I have seen since I fell asleep, and as early as a few years ago, I had counted such a day. As this voice fell, an emperor-robe figure slowly walked out from the depths of the heavenly court. The unspeakable aura of heaven circulates around him, making people just look at it, and never dare to look directly. After Jian Wushuang saw this scene, his pupils suddenly shrank, as if he had seen something unbelievable. The figure of the emperor wearing the emperor's clothes is exactly the same as Zhen Weiyang's. Whether it's the face, body shape, or the breath flowing through the body, they are exactly the same as Zhen Wuyang born, just like carved out of a mold. Do you think I am familiar with it, exactly like the emperor in your heart? The emperor came slowly to Jian Wushuang, his face calmly said. Jian Wushuang's heart was shocked and he said solemnly, Do you know what I'm thinking? Of course, everything I want to know is impossible to hide. He continued, his true eyes, as if he could see Jian Wushuang thoroughly. And Jian Wushuang couldn't help but panicked secretly. If it was exactly what he said, it would be too terrifying. The emperor continued, I had foreseen this scene a few years ago, but what I didn't expect was that the person who came would be a trivial immortal. Have you been to heavenly court? Facing the question, Jian Wushuang pondered for a moment, and finally nodded, I have been. Have you seen Zhen Wuyang? I have seen it. Do you think I am a little similar to him? Jian Wushuang nodded again, and muttered to himself, more than a little similar, is exactly the same. I also know myself, exactly the same as Zhen Wuyang. Do you want to know why? The emperor smiled slightly, although his face was no longer young, he could still see the endless heroism. He seemed to be in a memory, and Zhenmu looked over Jian Wushuang and looked into the distance. His name is Zhen Wuyang, and my name is Zhen Wu. However, 10,000 realms Tianyu only knows Emperor Zhen Wuyang, but not Emperor Zhen Wu. In other words, I am him, and he is also me. After Jian Wushuang heard this sentence, he was completely shocked. An emperor could separate two different individuals? Which of them is true and which is false? There is no true or false between us, it's just two different images. He said in a slow voice, the Emperor Zhenwu, who answered the doubts in his mind for Jian Wushuang. Chapter 4956. Emperor Zhenwu looked at him, Zhen Wuyang is one side, and I am his other side. Jian Wushuang didn't know how to describe this relationship anymore. As the supreme Emperor Zhen Wuyang in the entire vast Daisy realm, would he be sealed in the Sea of No Edge? This is really weird. And why did Zhen Wuyang seal him in the borderless sea? As if seeing what Jian Wushuang was thinking again, Emperor Zhenwu said in a slow voice, the only reason he wanted me to be here was that he could not control or destroy me. He could only keep me forever. The endless town is here. I am the other side of him, with a strength that is deeper than him, facing another him that cannot be controlled or destroyed. He made this move. I, sleeping here, want to leave all the time. As early as the eve of my imminent closure, I pushed to show you your appearance, so you should know how to do it. Hearing this, Jian Wushuang stepped back without a trace, his eyes flashed with vigilance. Take me out of here, in exchange for the same, I let you leave here, how about? Emperor Zhenwu approached him slowly. Jian Wushuang's mind turned quickly, and he quickly said, I'm afraid it won't work. I can't protect myself now. It's not realistic to want to leave here completely. The Emperor Zhenwu seemed to be able to penetrate his heart easily, and then said with a smile but a smile, you were not exiled by Zhen Wuyang, but you came involuntarily. An immortal who came involuntarily and can live safely until now, there will definitely be a way to get out. Jian Wushuang was a bit big-head for a while. I'm afraid it's only up to God's will to get out then. Emperor Zhenwu smiled slightly when he heard the words, then stretched out his hand to Jian Wushuang's arms. You have the breath of Emperor Wu Yang. He was taken aback, stretched out his hand and touched it in his arms, then took out a golden and jade ring. Why do you have Zhen Wuyang's ring? He gave it to you. Zhenwu Emperor said in a cold voice. Jian Wushuang said, he didn't give it to me, but someone else gave it to me. Emperor Zhenwu didn't go further, but his eyes were a bit solemn. Open the ring. Jian Wushuang had no choice but to follow suit. When the ring was opened, nothing happened. He breathed a sigh of relief without a trace, and then said, I will sleep in this ring later, and when you get out of the endless sea, you can release me from it, and then your task will be completed. Jian Wushuang heard this, although he was a little helpless, but he could only do it. After all, if he didn't agree, the result could be imagined. The only blame is that he is too weak, facing the level of the emperor, he can't even escape. After speaking these last words, the real body of Emperor Zhenwu directly turned into a cloud of smoke and entered the ring in Jian Wu's hands. Seeing a strange color from the ring in his hand, Jian Wushuang did not relax, but his mood became heavier. In his opinion, this Zhenwu emperor was not as harmless as he showed, but what he didn't say was the point. If the explanation takes him out of the borderless sea, I am afraid the entire Dasiu will fall into an unpredictable situation. Thinking of this, Jian Wushuang hurriedly stopped the thoughts he was thinking about, because he suddenly thought that this Zhenwu emperor could guess what he was thinking. At this moment, Emperor Zhenwu's faint voice rang from the ring again. By the way, after you leave here, remember not to return to Tianlu, leave here directly, and don't be discovered by them. After speaking these last words, Emperor Zhenwu's voice completely disappeared. And as the emperor's breath converged, the entire heavenly court supported by the emperor's breath began to enter an irreversible collapse. Emperor! Emperor! The gate of the heavenly court opened, and the two gatekeepers Dianxian rushed into the heavenly court in a panic. Their emperor has long since disappeared, how can they be found again? Jian Wushuang stood on the spot, watching the two immortal bodies of Dian Immortal guarding the gate continue to shatter, and finally died in the endless dust with the entire heavenly court. With the death of this heavenly court, the white bone road has long since disappeared, and even the blood river hanging above the head fluctuates violently at this moment. Jian Wushuang's figure stood in the void, his eyes looking forward. In front of the broken heavenly court site, a giant gate that seemed to have been sealed in dust for countless years appeared at this moment. Without any hesitation, Jian Wushuang went straight ahead. He had been under this river of blood and bones for a while, and could not stay any longer. A majestic force swept from his palm, and slammed on the giant gate. Boom! The entire domain of the Wanxian Bone and Blood River was in chaos at this moment. The giant gate slowly opened, and countless sacred flowers shone out from behind the giant gate. Without any hesitation, Jian Wushuang directly pushed himself into the giant gate. As the blooms dissipated, the hazy and misty breath under the river of blood disappeared, and replaced by the barren breath in the endless sea. Out! Looking at the grey-white land all over, Jian Wushuang let out a sigh of relief. At this moment, he should still be in the sky and land, but he has completely far away from the most central temple. Recalling Emperor Zhenwu's last request in his mind, he thought about it for a while before he decided to leave Tianyu directly. But what Jian Wushuang didn't expect was that when he stepped out of his front foot, dozens of cracking sounds sounded behind his back foot. The next moment, above the otherwise silent heaven and land, dozens of black robe envoys completely enclosed it from all directions. Roughly speaking, there are no fewer than 50 black robe envoys, and each of these black robe envoys is at the lowest level of rank 3. This undoubtedly gave Jian Wushuang a great pressure. The two sides were in a state of confrontation. In the end, a black robe envoy slowly stepped forward and arched his hands. His Royal Highness, please move to the Tiangong. What if I say no? He raised his brow slightly and said coldly. Hai Pao was startled. Obviously he didn't realize that Jian Wushuang would say that. If that's the case, don't blame us for being impolite. Hai Paoshi said coldly. In an instant, none of the 50 or so black robe envoys had any reservations. One by one, the powers are intertwined to construct, forming a net of heaven and earth to enclose the sword without double layers. Seeing the dense net spread over his body, Jian Wushuang's heart surged with anger. He did not have any intersection with the Emperor in this heaven and land, but he was involved in this mixed water for no reason, especially when he was dragged into the river of blood in his life of 9 deaths. After suffering, he was able to come out now. How can this keep him from getting angry? You're tuning in to the Celestial War YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.